The UK has just sent shockwaves through Russia. At a time when US President Donald Trump is pulling American aid from Ukraine, the UK is doubling down to provide billions more in support. It's preparing to send the proceeds from seized Russian assets Ukraine's way, meaning it's directly opposing Trump's approach to the war. So what has the UK just done with Russian assets? Why has it chosen now to finally unlock these billions of dollars in aid? And what does all of this mean for the future of the war? On March 1st, the Kyiv Independent reported that the UK had signed an agreement with Ukraine to provide a special type of loan. This loan is valued at $2.84 billion and will be used by Ukraine to purchase defense equipment from the UK and its other partners. But here's the most interesting part. That loan won't be backed by Britain's assets. Instead, it's underpinned by the billions of dollars in sanctioned Russian assets that are currently frozen in the United Kingdom. Both Ukraine and the UK have lauded the agreement. Ukraine's Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko says the United Kingdom continues to stand in the defense of Ukraine. Today's agreement, which strengthens Ukraine's defense capabilities, confirms this. The UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, mirrored those comments in quotes from the UK government's website. She highlighted the importance of helping Ukraine, stating, "A safe and secure Ukraine is a safe and secure United Kingdom. This funding will bolster Ukraine's armed forces and will put Ukraine in the strongest possible position at a critical juncture in the war." In other words, Reeves sees this loan as an investment into the UK's defense against Russia as much as it's an investment into Ukraine's defense. To emphasize that point, Reeves also pointed out the loan comes at a time when the UK is preparing to increase its defense spending to 2.5% of its gross domestic product, or GDP. That's 0.5% higher than NATO's 2% GDP recommendation, showcasing that the UK is prepared to make its money count in the fight against Putin. The loan will be distributed in 3 tranches, each worth around $950 million, with the first having arrived on March 7th. The loan also adds to the $3.82 billion per year the UK has already committed to Ukraine, meaning Kyiv will receive over $4.7 billion from the UK before the end of 2025. It all falls under the UK's Plan for Change, which includes the increase in defense spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, a commitment to supporting Ukraine, and a promise to raise defense spending to 3% of GDP further on in the future. The loan is also a massive shot at Russia and a sly shot at the United States. To Russia, this is the UK using its frozen sovereign assets to fund the country's biggest enemy. Russian President Vladimir Putin can only sit back and watch as his own money gets pumped into Ukraine to be used against him as he tries to claim more territory as part of his supposed special military operation. However, the decision will also send shockwaves through the United States. As Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's relationship shatters, this loan is a sign to both that the UK has essentially picked a side. It doesn't support the current methods being used to bring an end to the war. Instead, it's giving Ukraine what it needs to keep the war going. We'll come back to that point in a moment. First, it's important to explore the frozen Russian assets issue to understand why this is such a monumental move by the UK. Before Putin's invasion, Russia's central bank had invested around $300 billion into foreign currency assets, such as the dollar and the British pound. A further $30 billion was invested by oligarchs and officials who are typically close with Russia's leadership. The idea was to have this money stored in foreign currency reserves so that it could grow in value and be recalled at a later date. However, that date isn't coming anytime soon. When Putin launched his invasion, many of the countries that hold Russia's foreign currency assets froze them as part of their sanctions. The money couldn't be returned to Russia. It also couldn't be used for any purpose outside of Russia. The UK holds a significant portion of the frozen Russian assets. Estimates suggest that Russia has around $22 billion tied up in the British pound, though it's not clear how much of this money belongs to Russia's central bank and how much is linked to the country's oligarchs. Most of the rest of the frozen assets are tied up in the US dollar, the euro, and a variety of other currencies such as the Swiss franc and Japanese yen. A debate has raged over what to do with these assets. One of the most popular ideas, at least when the assets issue first arose, was to simply keep them for the duration of the Ukraine war. Once the war ended, the assets, along with the interest they earned, could be released to help rebuild Ukraine. While that's a sound idea on paper, the reality is that Putin's war has created more infrastructural damage to Ukraine than the frozen assets could cover. Plus, the money is a powerful tool. Perhaps a better use for it could be found. Another idea is to hold onto the assets as a negotiating tool for Ukraine. When peace talks occur, Zelensky could hold the assets over Putin's head, using them as leverage to get what he wants from the discussions, else Russia loses over $300 billion. Then there's what the UK is doing right now. Britain is keeping hold of the $22 billion in frozen Russian assets it has, but as for the interest those assets generate, that's fair game. The UK is essentially using the revenue generated from the Russian assets it holds to provide the $2.84 billion loan to Ukraine. It's a clever compromise. The frozen UK assets can still be used in future negotiations or to rebuild Ukraine when the time comes. Structuring the deal as a loan also gives the UK an out for the fact that it's using money generated from the Russian assets. This isn't money that the UK is taking from Russia. It's simply allowing Ukraine to borrow that cash. Ukraine gets access to the money it needs right now, with the frozen assets still being protected for future use. However, that isn't strictly accurate, at least in terms of this being a traditional loan, as we'll explain in a moment. For now, lending Ukraine the revenue generated from Russian assets seems to be the plan. However, it's also possible that the UK may choose to do something else with the frozen Russian assets. Just days before the UK announced its massive loan to Ukraine, Britain's Foreign Secretary David Lammy touted another idea. He said it was time for Britain to harden its position on Putin, which would include unfreezing the Russian assets so they could be used to support Ukraine. Europe has to act quickly, Lammy claimed, and I believe we should move from freezing assets to seizing assets. Lammy also told the UK Parliament that he would support any emergency legislation proposed that would make this seizure possible and allow Russian assets to serve Ukraine. Lammy also stressed this is something that Britain shouldn't do alone. It's not an issue on which any government can act alone. We must act with European allies, he said. The mention of Europe is important. The European Union holds a massive $250 billion of the frozen Russian assets, 10 times more than the UK holds. If Lammy's vision becomes a reality, those assets could be unfrozen, along with the UK's, to create a bumper aid package of a little over $240 billion for Ukraine. That isn't happening yet. However, the fact that such a prominent UK politician is talking about it suggests the idea is floating around. For now, the UK is happy to lend Ukraine money using the interest generated by its frozen Russian assets. It's also not a loan. On February 24th, 6 days before the UK asset-based loan was announced, Canada said that it was also going to deliver funds to Ukraine. Again, those funds would come from frozen Russian assets. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised a massive $5 billion aid package for Ukraine using the interest generated from the assets it holds. Trudeau made the announcement to mark the third year of Putin's invasion and used it to reinforce Canada's support of Ukraine's fight. This is not a conflict Ukraine wanted, provoked, or asked for in any way, Trudeau said during a Kyiv summit that marked the third anniversary of Putin's invasion. This is a war started for one reason and one reason only: Russia's desire to erase Ukrainian history and expand their empire. The $5 billion Canada promised is the first installment of revenues generated from Canada's frozen Russian assets that are due to Ukraine. Canada has promised to forfeit that money for several years, along with pushing its European partners to do the same. The EU may not quite be ready to do so. However, Britain's $2.84 billion aid package shows Canada's partners are listening. Could Trudeau's decision be a watershed moment? We'll have to wait and see what happens. For now, we can speculate that Trudeau's decision to give $5 billion in revenue from frozen Russian assets to Ukraine made it easier for the UK to follow through with its own package. The asset barrier has been broken, and the UK is following in Canada's footsteps. Still, this brings us to a pair of interesting questions. How will the $2.84 billion in seized Russian funds be used, and why is the UK doing this right now? The Kyiv Independent provides some answers to the first question. It says that the loan is part of the Group of Seven, or G7's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration (ERA) credit initiative. The G7 created this mechanism to provide up to $50 billion worth of non-repayable financial support to Ukraine. It combines individual bilateral loans provided by the US, UK, Japan, and Canada, along with a macro-financial assistance loan facility created by the EU to enable all of its member nations to contribute. The US will contribute the bulk of the $50 billion loan, around $20 billion, with the EU providing a combined $19.4 billion. The rest will come from Canada, Japan, and the UK, with the latter providing $2.8 billion in total, the entire sum it's just promised to Ukraine. Note the use of the word non-repayable. That casts a new light on the $2.84 billion the UK has just loaned Ukraine, and it explains why this isn't a traditional loan. This is essentially a loan in name only. Ukraine isn't expected to repay the money specifically because it's being funded by interest and revenue generated on the frozen Russian assets the UK holds. The $2.84 billion is essentially a grant under a different name, with the loan mechanism being a diplomatic tool the G7 nations can use to claim they're not giving Russia's frozen assets to Ukraine. As for how Ukraine will spend the money, Ukraine's finance ministry keeps it brief. It will go toward purchasing defense equipment according to Ukraine's needs. Translation: it'll be spent on weapons to fight Russia. So we now know how Ukraine will use the money, along with more about the mechanism under which it's provided. But why has the UK chosen now to deliver its bumper loan? Well, part of the reason comes down to the commitment we just mentioned. Under the ERA, the UK was duty-bound to provide $2.8 billion to Ukraine, which was generated from Russia's frozen assets. That would be the end of the story right there, were it not for the fact that the US, which has a $20 billion commitment under the same program, has only delivered $1 billion of ERA loans to Ukraine. The US has actually fulfilled its commitment by transferring the full $20 billion to the World Bank Fortis Ukraine FIF Fund in December 2024, though only $1 billion has been dispersed so far. Something is off with these numbers. The UK has just fulfilled its entire commitment at a time when the US has only delivered a 20th of what it promised. This comparison is misleading as the US funds are structured for gradual disbursement through 2027, similar to the UK's approach of making 3 annual payments of $950 million. Perhaps there's more to it than just a commitment. The delivery of these funds also seems to showcase some interesting timing on the UK's part. It comes at a time when the relationship between the US and Ukraine is fraying. Tensions between the two began brewing even before the war started. When Zelensky was elected in April 2019, Trump, then in his first stint as president, called to congratulate Ukraine's leader on winning an incredible election. However, as the year progressed, Trump began fueling allegations that then Democratic contender for the upcoming presidential elections, Joe Biden, was lobbying Ukraine to dismiss its top prosecutor. The reason, Trump claimed, was to slow down investigations into an energy firm named Burisma, for which Biden's son, Hunter, served as a member of the board. July 2019 saw Trump call Zelensky to ask him to get to the bottom of the issue. The allegations against Hunter Biden were later found to be fabricated. That phone conversation with Zelensky would also become the basis of Trump's first impeachment. This may have created the grounds for Trump to resent Zelensky later on. Biden was president when Putin launched his supposed special military operation in February 2022. Trump claimed he would end the war in one day if he was elected back in March 2023, with Trump's campaign being marked by small clashes with Zelensky. September 2024 saw Zelensky say, "My feeling is that Trump doesn't really know how to stop the war, even if he might think he knows how." Trump responded in the same month by claiming that Zelensky was making nasty little aspersions. Still, things seemed to be fine between the two when Trump won the November 2024 election. Zelensky called Trump to congratulate him on his win. Trump also proclaimed that it was time to make a deal in January 2025, adding that he would be forced to place further economic restrictions on Russia if Putin didn't play ball. Then it all started to go downhill for the relationship between Zelensky and Trump. On February 18th, the US delegation held a meeting with the Russians in Saudi Arabia to discuss conditions for ending the Ukraine war. That meeting didn't include Zelensky or any European nations. Zelensky claimed the meeting took place behind Ukraine's back, with Trump saying that he was disappointed in the Ukrainian president's reaction. A day later, Trump called Zelensky a dictator, while claiming that he's done a terrible job and had talked the US into spending $350 billion on Ukraine. On February 28th, Zelensky and Trump took part in a tense meeting at the White House. The two clashed on several issues, with Trump accusing Zelensky of being disrespectful. Then Trump made the claim that may have prompted the UK into action. "Your people are very brave," Trump told Zelensky, "but you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out." This wasn't an idle threat. On March 3rd, 2 days after the UK announced its $2.84 billion loan to Ukraine, the United States said it was pausing and reviewing all military aid to Kyiv. As Politico reports, all US equipment promised to Ukraine that isn't already on the front lines will be paused. That includes equipment in transit. It'll either be held where it is or sent back to the US. Trump's goal appears to be to push Zelensky into signing a rare minerals deal with the US, which could lead to a larger negotiation on ending the Ukraine war. Saying the last few months have been a rollercoaster for Trump and Zelensky would be an understatement, and the UK has been paying attention. Its decision to deliver the full $2.8 billion it had committed to sending Ukraine now may have been motivated in part by the fraught relationship between Trump and Zelensky. The UK can't predict what that relationship will look like during the next week, never mind over the next few months. By sending the $2.8 billion in March, the UK may have just avoided being dragged into the conflict between Trump and Zelensky. The UK has actually structured this loan into 3 equal payments over the next 3 years, meaning the full amount has been earmarked but not entirely dispersed yet. For example, imagine that Trump started placing pressure on the UK to halt all of its aid to Ukraine. Having already granted this loan, the UK could argue that it's already sent money to Ukraine that it can't reclaim, allowing it to strike a balance where it maintains its relationship with both Washington and Kyiv. However, since 2/3 of the loan is still pending, the US could still attempt to pressure the UK into halting the remaining payments. We could also see the UK's loan as an attempt to separate itself from the US on Ukraine policy. Hints of this potential split were seen on March 1st, the day the UK granted the loan, when British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer met with Zelensky in London. Starmer told Zelensky that Ukraine has full backing across the United Kingdom as he embraced Ukraine's leader. The $2.8 billion loan was also framed as a sign of Britain's unwavering and ongoing support for the Ukrainian people. Perhaps Starmer is sending a subtle message to Trump with the loan. While Zelensky and Trump ride their relationship roller coaster, Britain is showing the US that its foreign policy won't be influenced by American decisions. Where Trump is using the suspension of military aid as a show of force, Britain is using its $2.8 billion loan as a demonstration of solidarity. How this will affect the UK's relationship with the US remains to be seen. However, there have been suggestions that Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron are considering accompanying Zelensky on the Ukrainian president's next visit to the White House. Perhaps we're seeing Britain attempting to play peacemaker between two nations that are supposed to be allies. On one hand, it delivers a bumper loan to Ukraine. On the other, it serves as a mediator between Trump and Zelensky to help the pair get their relationship back on track. The UK may be playing the long game with its new loan. The only question remaining is what will happen to the rest of the Russian assets frozen in the UK and Europe. It may be some time before we see an answer. Despite David Lammy's suggestion that it's time to unfreeze assets and send them all to Ukraine, many in Europe don't agree. Those include the previously mentioned Macron, who met with Trump a couple of days before the UK announced its loan. "We have $250 billion worth of frozen Russian assets in Europe, but this does not belong to us, so they are frozen," Macron said during the meeting. "If at the end of the day in the negotiation we would have with Russia, they are ready to give it to us, super." Macron is suggesting that Russia may forfeit the assets as part of a peace negotiation, playing into their possible use as leverage. France's president also hints that he's wary about using the frozen assets to support Ukraine. Doing so would create serious legal questions about the principle of immunity that's supposed to apply to sovereign assets, which would undermine Europe. Britain may disagree. Lammy's claims that Europe should unfreeze and use the assets suggest the UK may think that Russia's sacrificed any claim to asset immunity when it challenged Ukraine's sovereign status. Should sovereign immunity apply to a nation that's shown it's willing to ignore another country's sovereign status altogether? That's a question for another day. What's certain is that the UK has just handed a $2.8 billion lifeline to Ukraine at a time when the US is pausing its support for Kyiv. How do you think this will impact the UK's relationship with the US? Are there specific weapons you feel Ukraine should use the $2.8 billion to buy? And where do you see this political drama surrounding the war going next? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you as always for watching the video.